Greetings, students. I hope you're doing well. We are continuing to discuss the Platonic dialogues. We have discussed the transitional piece, the Meno. We've gone into the symposium. We've beheld the form of beauty, or we've tried, right? We've beheld beauty in itself. And now we are looking at the Phaedo today, right? The dramatic framing of the Phaedo involves Socrates' death. This is finally the day that Socrates dies. He's been imprisoned for a while, right? We remember from the Apology that Socrates could not be executed while the mission to Delos was away from Athens. And now the ship has returned. Socrates must die this very day. His friends show up early at the jail to speak with him one last time. Naturally, Socrates and his friends get to talking about death, right? Plato wasn't there. He makes a point of letting us know he wasn't there. One of the characters mentions that Socrates was ill on this day, right? There's another layer to it where people are looking back on the day that Socrates died, right? And so someone in this higher frame of reference looks back on that day, explains who was there, and says that Plato was ill. And we don't need to get into all that framing, but I did want to explain that Plato makes a point of letting us know, hey, I wasn't there, so this is presumably a pretty free rendering of what happened, right? So again, Plato is suggesting to us that, this is not necessarily what Socrates said or would have said, right? We've seen Plato do this in different ways, let us know in different ways that, this isn't exactly what Socrates believed. So it happens again here, right? And so it looks like a lot of these arguments are really Plato's arguments, right? And that's why we count this as a Platonic dialogue, and so that's why I've said we're continuing with the Platonic dialogues. Okay, so let's get into it. I'm going to proceed a little more directly than usual, I think, because the argumentation is kind of dense. I won't be very textual today. I won't, or at least I'm not planning to be. I won't say Simmias said this and Cebes said that, or not as much as I often do. We'll take it for granted that Socrates is doing a lot of the talking, and he's trying to convince Simmias and Cebes. These are the other main participants in the conversation besides Socrates. He's trying to convince them of some things, right? And so he'll make arguments and he'll get them to agree on things. Sometimes they initiate their own lines of argument or make their own points, but Socrates is really pushing and doing the work here, right? And so we'll sort of take that as understood, right? And sometimes I'll just say how the argument goes without really saying who said what, or again, at least that's my plan. Okay, but I will start by saying, Simmias and Cebes are worried. They're worried about Socrates. They're worried about what's going to happen when Socrates is dead. Now, of course, part of that worry is, what about Socrates himself? Where is he going to wind up? Where is he going to go? In that vein, Simmias mentions that Evenus is looking to be advised, what can Simmias tell Evenus from Socrates, since Evenus is clearly not going to see him again? What words of wisdom can Socrates pass on? Socrates says, will tell Evenus, who was mentioned highly in the Apology, you might recall, right? So again, we see continuity. Things even as far back as the Apology are coming up again. Anyway, Socrates says, will tell Evenus to follow me as soon as possible. Right? In other words, death is good. Right? I'm on my way. I'm headed there. Evenus should go ahead and follow me. This, of course, sounds a little shocking, and so Simmias and Cebes want to know, is that right? Should he really want to follow you quickly? Is this the attitude people should really have toward death? Should they want to sort of hurry toward it? Socrates, eventually backs off the idea that they should hurry toward death, makes this suggestion that we're the wards of the gods, right? And so, we can't dispose of ourselves as freely as we might want to. So in theory, actually, Evenus should follow Socrates as quickly as possible because it's better in the other realm. However, there are reasons we can't just kill ourselves sort of willy-nilly. That's the view that actually emerges. Why should philosophers be ready and willing to die? There are different passes at this, and the first one isn't very satisfying, and so this is also something we've seen before. You make a first pass at an argument or a first pass at giving an account, and it isn't very satisfying, but it lays the groundwork for better things. So on a first pass, the idea is that, as was suggested in the Apology, when Socrates leaves this realm and goes to another one, there will be good and wise people there. And so he can be in the company of good and wise people. He can interrogate them. He can talk to them about their lives. He can talk to them maybe about philosophy. Some of them will be interested. Some of them might not be, right? And the gods themselves, will be around, will be looking after the people in the underworld, and so Socrates will be well taken care of. He's very confident in his moral character, right? So he's sure that he'll be around good people. The gods will take good care of him once he has left this realm. This isn't very satisfying, as I already said. Socrates was very agnostic about the afterlife in the Apology. He's not called on it here, so I'm not suggesting that. But readers will be put in mind of Socrates' agnosticism, or they should be put in mind of it, right? And so the other characters give Socrates a hard time. They don't accept all of this at face value. They push Socrates to say more, to say something deeper, to give a more substantial account, right? And so, of course, he does. He claims at 64a, to give us an anchor in the text now that we're starting to get specific here. So Socrates says at 64a, the one aim of those who practice philosophy in the proper manner is to practice for dying and death, right? So this is what philosophers do anyway. They prepare for death, they get ready for death. So it would be strange, or it would be inconsistent, he could say, he just says strange. It would be inconsistent to get worried about death when it finally comes close, right? Since philosophy is really a preparation for death. Now, of course, this raises the issue of how philosophy is a preparation for death. Well, at 64c, Socrates says that death is the separation of the soul from the body, and this is what the philosopher continually practices. The philosopher continually separates the soul from the body, right? Well, how does that work? Well, the philosopher eschews pleasures to a large extent. You know, maybe that's not an image we have of contemporary philosophers. Maybe I don't eschew the pleasures as much as Socrates did, but you can tell that in the Platonic community, let's say, this was something philosophers were known for, turning away from pleasure, right? Trying to be moderate. Moderation, of course, is a key Greek virtue. So that was emphasized, and moderation often meant refraining a lot. So maybe it wasn't even as moderate as it was initially intended to be. Maybe maybe other Greeks would have thought, well, you're not really being moderate, but that was a word they used, and their idea of moderation was, well, don't let pleasure really push you around, right? Don't get too agitated by it. Don't get too excited by it. Don't let the desire for pleasure move you very much. Don't let it motivate you very much, right? So that's their idea about pleasure. So from Socrates' point of view, the philosopher just tends to turn away from pleasure anyway. That's just part of being a philosopher, and cultivates the soul. The body gets in the way of real thinking and true knowledge, right? So here we can use the symposium to understand better what Socrates is saying. Eventually, the theory of the forms will emerge anyway in this text, but fortunately we're already familiar. So let's raise this question in terms of what we already know about the form of beauty and the form of the good. Why do philosophers turn away from the body, and how does that help with thinking, and how does that help with true knowledge? Well, remember, in the ascent, in the ladder, when you're going up the stairs, you start with particular bodies that are beautiful, right? That's what you're attracted to at first. And then you realize, oh, the human body is beautiful, right? And you're not so attached to particular bodies anymore, and then you fall in love with souls, and so on, and the things you keep falling in love with are increasingly abstract, right? I mentioned that in the last lecture. So you're getting more and more abstract, and you're eventually looking at beauty itself, or beauty in itself, you could also call it. Not mixed beauty, not relative beauty, as we said last time, but beauty on its own, in itself, right? Which, of course, anything that's beautiful would share in. So this is the most abstract of a series of abstract objects, right? So those initial bodies that you perceived that were beautiful, they're very far removed from the ultimate object of inquiry, which is beauty in itself, right? And so, in a way, right, even though you need those beautiful bodies, you need particulars to get thinking going, right, to have something to think about. By the time you get to your ultimate object of inquiry, you've abstracted and gotten farther and farther away from the particulars of perception. So the particulars can initiate thought, but you don't want to keep going back to them. You want to get more and more remote from them in order to behold the forms, right? And so that's why Socrates can say here, as he does, that the body is a distraction. Body doesn't really help us have knowledge. It sort of triggers things, but then we have to turn away and refine the information that we received from the body in order to get true knowledge. That's the way Plato looks at it, for sure, right? And then at 65D through E, the forms are mentioned. Socrates gets Simmias and Cebes to agree. You can tell they've talked about it a lot already. There's a lot of water under the bridge. They all agree there's such a thing as the just itself, the beautiful itself, the good itself. These are the realities of the things that we perceive, right? So that wasn't quite said in the symposium, so that's new to us, right, given our trajectory, right? I think, when we were looking at the symposium, we were sort of focused on the idea of origin, right? Somehow beauty causes the beautiful things to be. Ultimately, this is not exactly the same point, to be clear. What we're saying is, right now, there are beautiful things, and they're participating in beauty. And so the form of beauty is constituting them as beautiful things, right? This should remind us of, something that was said in the Socratic dialogues, right? Socrates wants to know in the Euthyphro, tell me that form itself, that makes the pious things pious, or in virtue of which they're pious. Right now, it wasn't really clear how literal that was meant at the time. It looked like Socrates really just wanted a definition, and it was enough if things shared a certain appearance, right? So we weren't necessarily getting into the metaphysical depths when we were looking for the form back then. But now we're saying, beauty itself is the reality of the beautiful particulars, and the just itself is the reality of the just particulars, right? So somehow the form or the forms, I guess, plural, participate in the world of particulars. There's not a good theory given about how that works. I like to think of an attractor, because Plato likes to emphasize love in different ways in different texts. So you could think of the forms sort of attracting particulars to themselves and then forming the particulars in certain ways. So you get beautiful particulars and just particulars and good particulars, right? And so on. So maybe the view is something like that, right? And there is a different dialogue where Plato gives a grand cosmological view and tries to tell us, the role that the forms play in forming the universe. But we don't need to get into that here. I'm just making broad suggestions based on things Plato tends to say, right? So maybe these forms attract particulars to themselves, or looking at it from the point of view of the particulars, maybe they are drawn by love toward the forms, right, and come to resemble the forms that they go toward, or something like that. It's got to be loose here. We're not given a good account. At 65E through 66A, this is along the same lines we've already been formulating. Socrates says that the body provides confusing evidence about the forms. The soul, of course, can approach the forms as pure objects of thoughts in their unmixed state. So again, the the philosopher has to move away from the body and has to cultivate the soul separately from the body, as detached from the body as much as possible, right? And that's how we pursue the truth. That's how we get at the forms. That's how we get, in the new language that we're using, that's how we really get at the realities of things. We have to practice this detachment, right? So then we work up to a sort of climax at 66e. Socrates says, it is impossible, that's strongly formulated, it is impossible to attain any pure knowledge with the body. And because of that, either we shall never attain any pure knowledge, or we shall do so only after death. Right? So it's impossible to attain any pure knowledge of the body. It's impossible to attain any pure knowledge with the body. And because that's so, either we don't have knowledge, right? Because after all, the forms are the realities of what we see. So in a sense, we can't know the particulars if we don't know the forms. I'm just taking things to their logical conclusion. This is tentative in the text at first, right? At first we say, well, we can't know the forms, unless our souls continue after death. But it follows from other points in the text, right? I think we can already see that the overall thrust of things is, well, we can't really have knowledge unless the soul continues after death, right? And then Socrates certainly could argue, I think it's implied, well, we do have knowledge, don't we? Right? He and Cebes and Simmias have agreed that they know some things, right? So in a way, the very fact that we have knowledge, right, that we're able to grasp beauty and goodness and justice, or even equality, even mathematical equality, this will come up soon enough, the very fact that we can grasp such things suggests that the soul is immortal, right? And so recollection hasn't come up as an explicit theme yet, but we're starting to see already that death must be the separation of the soul from the body. That wasn't argued for earlier. It was just stated, and everybody agreed to it. But we can see how it follows that death must be the separation of the soul from the body, and the soul must endure when separated, right, for recollection to work, right? So we had a theory of recollection back in the Meno, but we're getting refinement of it. We're starting to see more clearly, I think, why the soul needs to be immortal for recollection to work. In a way, the forms themselves, again, this will be more clear later in the text, the forms themselves are separate from the physical particular world. So then it turns out, we can keep refining the arguments, but we're starting to see that the soul then needs to be separate from the physical and from the particulars in order to really grasp the forms, in order to see them clearly. Okay, so all that is fine, I think. we get it. It helps make sense of where we've already been, and so hopefully it's falling into place for us. At 70a, Cebes points out that people have trouble believing that the soul can endure after death, right? They think of it as very fine and fragile. To elaborate a bit, actually, on what Cebes is thinking. it's like a vapor or breath or maybe even flame. I'm just sort of getting into Greek conceptions of the soul in general. So it's something that would dissolve or fly away after death, right? It wouldn't stick around, um, and wouldn't maintain cohesion, wouldn't stay together after one's death, right? So he's pressing Socrates to say more. Tell me more about how the soul could possibly endure after death, right? So at 70e to 71a, Socrates starts this line of argument about opposites and how, in general, opposites come to be from opposites, right? And this might very well put us in mind of Heraclitus. Perhaps the argument here is inspired by Heraclitus. Day comes from night, night comes from day. You remember that kind of idea from Heraclitus. Socrates gives examples like that. The smaller comes from the bigger, that sort of thing, in order to make this broad point that, generally speaking, opposites come to be from opposites. And not only that, but since opposites come to be from opposites, he says at 71b, there has to be a process of going from, A to B, let's say. Say that A and B are opposites, so there has to be a process of going from A to B, and there has to be a process of going from B to A, right? Because if there weren't this dynamism, if there weren't this back and forth, if there weren't the two processes balancing each other out, then everything would end up in the same state, right? So again, day and night, those are opposites, or light and dark, if you like, those are opposites. They're two poles, right? So there's brighter and darker, but there's also just completely bright, or at least Socrates would have said so, and there's completely dark, which is more obvious, right? So you go back and forth between these two poles, and so there has to be a mechanism by which this occurs. In other words, there has to be a brightening or a lightening, and there has to be a darkening, right? And of course, if we're talking about the earth, we know how this works. The sun starts to come up, right? We see it start to peak up above the horizon. We get a little light even before that, right? We get a little light in the sky, then the sun starts to peak above the horizon, and it gets brighter and brighter and brighter, and so we've got the brightening that we were looking for, and seems to keep getting brighter. Maybe, it's not so perceptible, but probably just keeps getting brighter until, the sun's at the zenith. There it is at the top of the sky. Everything's very bright at that point, and then imperceptibly at first, the sun starts coming down from its position at the height of the sky, and you get the darkening, right? So we need both processes. If all it did was brighten, then everything would just get maximally bright eventually, and we'd be stuck there. And if it just got darker, then it would just get absolutely dark at some point, and that would be it, and we'd be done, right? Okay, so let's apply this then to life and death, to the living and the dead. Opposites come to be from opposites. So life comes to be from death, just as much as, we already knew the other side of it. Death comes to be from life, right? We know that everything living dies, in our experience, maybe just temporarily, according to this line of argument. But yeah, we're familiar with the idea that what's living comes to be dead, but we need both processes, according to the argument here, to balance things out, to keep everything from getting to be in the same state. So just as much as the living eventually end up dead, the dead have to come to life again, right? And that's exactly how Socrates puts it. There have to be two processes, right? There has to be a process of dying, and there has to be a process of coming to life again, right? I mean, it works and it doesn't work, right? In a sense. Yes, I suppose it's true as far as it goes. If you just had the process of dying, right, and you didn't have the process of coming to life again, right? I mean, how does that work mechanically within the theory? So dying, on this view, dying is when the soul comes apart from the body, right? And so the souls are getting released, right? And then they're going to the underworld, and then the coming to life again is when the souls come back into the bodies. So on this view, eventually the souls all end up in the underworld because they're just getting released and they're not coming back, right? So that taking all this very literally, it seems to be meant literally. I guess on that view, when there's just dying, all the souls end up trapped in the underworld, and they can't be reincarnated. They're stuck, right? Or if there were just coming to life again, then it would be the opposite. You'd run out of souls in the underworld, and there wouldn't be any more to put into the bodies, right? So you need these things to balance out. I mean, that's fine. That works. And I think in general, it works that, well, sometimes at least, Socrates wants to universalize. Always opposites come to be from opposites. I don't know about that part exactly, and I think our notion of opposite can actually be a bit fuzzy. But I'll say sometimes opposites come to be from opposites, and then they have to balance each other out, and that's true, right? But a couple of problems with this line of argument. First of all, the immateriality of the soul is being assumed, right? I mean, taking it at face value, taking it literally, as I was saying, you end up with the souls trapped in the underworld, or you run out of souls coming from the underworld. And so you're imagining these immaterial things being shuffled around, going into bodies, coming out of bodies. That's fine, but that's probably part of what we wanted to prove, right? Probably part of what Simmias and Cebes wants to know, or what they want to know, is, why do you think the soul is immaterial in the first place? If it's immaterial, it makes some sense to say it's immortal as well. Then that comes up later, right? If it's material, it's liable to decompose or disintegrate. If it's immaterial, we don't have any reason to think it has parts. It could be pure and simple, and then it wouldn't disintegrate or decompose, and so then it could be immortal in that case. So that kind of argumentation comes up later, right? But here, we're assuming immateriality of the soul, right? And that's not warranted right now. Right, and then as I said, the very notion of an opposite is a bit fuzzy, right? It's not clear that there's always an objective answer to the question, what's really the opposite of X, right? And so in other words, here we're saying that the opposite of the living is the dead. Well, what if I said the opposite of the living is inorganic matter? Why is that not as plausible. And obviously, this is related to my other point that we're just assuming the soul is immaterial, right? So maybe the opposites at issue are organic matter, animated matter, and inorganic matter. And then, right, some of the argument would work, but it wouldn't get us what we want. In other words, you can't just keep turning inorganic matter into organic. You'll run out, right? There have to be some inorganic things that can be collected and taken up into organic processes, and then then you can keep the process going. If you run out, there's no nourishment available, I guess, for the organic beings, right? I mean, ultimately, let's be clear and blunt. I mean, they consume each other and turn each other into inorganic matter. I guess, just to be really clear here. So you need to have processes that work in both directions, right? And also, if we're being really literal about all of this, we need a sun to give us warmth and light, and that's not an organic being. There's no organic matter there, as far as I know. Right. So you can't push it to its extreme either way. You lose something. You can't have all organic matter. The organic matter can't survive under those conditions. And obviously, if everything did was decompose, there wouldn't be any life anymore. So the very fact that we have organic matter and inorganic matter, and they both exist, suggests that there are processes balancing each other out here. So it's not the worst argument ever. It works to some extent, but there are some illicit assumptions here that are causing problems. And I have to admit that. Although later we do get an argument for the immateriality of the soul, right? And so that certainly helps bolster the case. But we don't have that here. Okay, now Cebes brings up recollection at 72e to 73a. He wants to remind us, and so now we'll recollect, that the existence of recollection suggests immortality. Recollection is only possible if our souls existed before they got into their bodies, right? So this can constitute another line of argument. On the one hand, I mean, it works both ways, right? So on the one hand, the fact of recollection bolsters the case for the immortality of the soul, right? And I think things were mainly going in that direction in the Meno, right? But also, the more you can bolster the case for the immortality of the soul, the more you can bolster the case for recollection, because at least on the view of recollection at issue here, the immortality of the soul is a condition that we need to have in place for recollection to work, right? We're recollecting from, some other life, maybe some disembodied life, most plausibly, right? So Cebes brings up recollection. It's clearly relevant, right? Recollection is only possible if what Socrates is saying is true. So let's examine recollection, since the inference works both ways. In a way, Socrates has just been supporting recollection, but let's look at recollection, and then that will support the immortality of the soul, right? The cases bolster each other. And the participants in the dialogue seem to recognize that. At 73b, Simmias says he wants to experience recollection to complete the proof, right, as he says. So help me, Socrates, help me recollect some things. Okay, at 73c, Socrates begins to explain again from scratch what recollection really is. Sometimes a thing brings two things to mind. It brings to mind itself, and it brings to mind something else. The first thing that's brought to mind, when it brings to mind itself, that's perception. When it brings to mind something else, that's recollection, right? So one of the examples is a picture of Simmias, right? So on the one hand, you perceive the picture of Simmias, right? You're just having a perception. And then, of course, it brings to mind Simmias, right? That would be the most natural thing to happen. You perceive a picture of Simmias, and now you're thinking of Simmias, but he's not there, so you're recollecting, right? He's not actually present. You're just looking at a picture. So he's being recalled. He comes to mind because you're looking at a picture, right? And of course, it might bring Cebes to mind, right? So Simmias and the picture of Simmias are similar to each other. Now, Cebes, of course, looks different from Simmias. And they're boyfriends, by the way. It's pretty clear in the text. That people see them together all the time, right? That's why they're being used as an example. So you see a picture of Simmias, and you might think of Simmias, but then you might think of Cebes, right? Because in your mind, they're associated. You see them together a lot. So a thing can bring to mind something similar to itself, or a thing can bring to mind something that's dissimilar to itself. Now, when a thing brings to mind something similar, right, that's the case in which a picture of Simmias, makes you think of Simmias. And that, in that kind of case, it's natural to think about, a deficiency in the likeness, as Socrates puts it, right? So you wouldn't think of a deficiency when Simmias brings Cebes to mind. They're just different. They're different people and they look different. But when a picture of Simmias brings Simmias to mind, then you think, oh, what a great picture. Or you think, well, that's not I can see that that's meant to be Simmias, but that's not a very good picture. So when something brings something similar to mind, you might think of the deficiencies, of the thing that's like the other thing, right? So if you've got a picture of A that brings A to mind, you might think of how that picture of A is deficient with respect to A. This is a very important point. That's why I'm harping on it. You're probably, at this point, wondering, why is he going on so much about deficiencies here? Well, this is important with respect to equality and the discussion of equality here. You look at equal sticks, and the thing about equal sticks is, well, they're equal in some respects and not in others. I mean, actual sticks in the world, go pick a couple. You could try to make sure they're the same length, and that's great. So that's one kind of equality they share. But then they're going to be different in other ways. The sticks are going to be a little knobby, and the knobs will be in different locations on the length of the stick. And the coloring will be a little different, and maybe one of them is starting to bud, and maybe the other one isn't, and so on. So the sticks will be equal, and they won't be equal, right? So you look at equal sticks, and they bring to mind equality itself, right? And so in that case, you can't help but think of how the equal sticks are deficient with respect to equality itself, right? In other words, look, the equal is always the equal, The equal is never unequal, right? Equality itself is never unequal. It always is what it is, right? I mean, that seems like common sense, right? When you put it that way. One wonders whether we can talk about equality as a sort of entity unto itself, but it sounds natural, right? Well, there's equality itself, and equality itself is sort of our standard for what is equal in the world, right? And we look at things that are somewhat equal in the world, and generally speaking, it's implied that this always happens. It's maybe not quite stated. We look at equal things in the world, and just it's always the case that they're never perfectly equal. They're never exactly equal. However, equality is perfectly equal. Equality could never be mistaken for inequality, right? Because equality is the standard by which we measure. We could always look at supposedly equal things and in our minds sort of hold them up to the standard and see where they satisfy the standard and see where they fail to satisfy the standard. So the particulars fail, as perfect examples of equality itself or justice itself or beauty itself and so on, right? This works for all particulars. You look at some beautiful bodies, well, you could find a blemish, right? Or you look at two beautiful bodies and they're not beautiful in exactly the same way anyway. Even if you just concentrate on the beauty, well, they're not the same in all respects. They're not beautiful in the same way. They don't have the same features, even insofar as they're beautiful, right? So beauty itself must be separate from the beautiful bodies, right? And maintain its identity as a standard for judging of the beautiful things. And equality itself must be separate from the equal things and maintain its identity as a standard that is separate from the equal things. Okay, so then it follows, this is said explicitly from 74E to 75C, it follows that our knowledge of the equal has to precede any knowledge of our perception of the equals, right? Because we could always judge of the equals how equal they are, right? How far back does it go? Well, whenever we've looked at equals, as far as we can remember, we've been able to look for where they're equal and where they're not. So this must be an inborn idea. We're born with it, right? It's there in our soul from the beginning. We're sort of reminded of it when we start examining equals, right? And that's why Plato likes this word recollection, right? The equal particulars, or the approximately equal particulars, bring to mind equality, right? And when did we learn equality? Well, not in this life, because in this life, all we've got is particulars. So before the time when we were embodied and beheld nothing but particulars, there was a time when the soul was by itself, in the realm of the forms, whatever realm that is, right, and had perfect access to them. And now when we look at equal particulars, we recollect the form of the equal, and we use it as a standard to judge the equal particulars. Or in this life, we behold the beautiful bodies, and we recollect the standard of beauty, the perfect form of beauty, and that allows us to judge of the beautiful bodies, the extent to which they actually are beautiful, and the extent to which they're not quite, right, where they don't live up to the standard, right? And then, in general, forms are standards, right? And again, this is different from the Euthyphro, but also goes all the way back to the Euthyphro. Give me a model, Socrates said back then, so that I can use it to judge of the pious things, or the supposedly pious things. Are they really pious? Or I can judge of things whether they're impious. Give me that model. That is part of what's coming up here. There is a perfect standard somewhere, or we don't know anything, right? We could always sort of bring up that sort of absurdist alternative, or that's how Plato sees it, or we never really know whether something's beautiful, or we never really know whether things are equal. We can't learn equality and beauty from the particulars. So there has to be this inborn knowledge. The soul has to get acquainted with it before it's born. And then the alternative is we have no idea whether things are equal. We have no idea whether things are beautiful, and we're just spouting words, right? There's always that possibility. But Plato is confident that we have some knowledge, and so the forms exist. And since they exist, the soul had to get acquainted with them before it was born. Okay, so we're sort of building up to the point which is never perhaps fully stated. Either there are forms and our souls are immortal, and that's how they got acquainted with the forms, or we don't know anything, really, right? Because particulars are so messy. They're such a mess, and they're always changing, and we can't hold on to them, and they're unreliable, right? Either there's this other realm, and there are these forms, and they act as standards, and we can use them to judge the particulars correctly at any given moment before they change, or it's all a mess and we don't know anything. Right? Or a different way to put that is the forms are suitable objects of knowledge because they have enough stability and substance to be something we can know about. And then the particulars are not really by themselves, even though they trigger knowledge, they're not really by themselves suitable objects of knowledge because they're always changing, right? So that's what we're going to cover in any detail here, and then I'll just remind you that we did have an argument for the soul that for the immortality of the soul, I should say, that wasn't very satisfying, and I've already suggested here. I'll give you a page number now. I've already suggested that. We go on to get an argument for the immateriality of the soul. We don't just rest it on the argument from opposites that sort of worked and sort of didn't work. So starting at 78b, we get this new line of argument that involves, there are two aspects to it, but I'm going to be really brief here. We make a distinction between composite things and pure and simple things on the one hand, and it certainly looks like the body is composite, and so it's prone to disintegrate and it's prone to come apart. And the soul seems simple and pure. You have to think of how you grasp your own mind. It doesn't seem to have parts, right? And actually, this is not just something the ancients thought. This is a theme in cognitive science in the present day. People talk about the unified field of consciousness. Why does consciousness always appear as a unity, right? Brain damage occurs and things sort of disappear from the unified field, but whatever is there always appears as a unity. Consciousness is always a unity. This is actually an object of scientific study, right? So, to some extent, science bears out what Plato is saying through Socrates. The soul seems pure and simple. The body seems composite. Composite things disintegrate. The pure and simple need not come apart and disintegrate. Right, so it looks like the soul can survive the death of the body, and then there's no reason to hold it would disintegrate once it has survived the death of the body. And I'm not saying cognitive science supports that conclusion, but as far as the observation, that grounds the conclusion, yes. People are very interested in why consciousness always appears as a unity in this way, right? And then the other line of argument, or the other kind of consideration that comes up here is, well, isn't the soul like the forms and unlike the particulars? I mean, this is related, but it's its own issue. The forms have to be eternal. They're in themselves unmixed, pure, aren't going to change ever, right? That's the kind of fixed standard we need to make these judgments about the particulars, so we can have knowledge. So that's what the forms are like, pure and stable and unchanging, and so immortal and infinite in their way. Right? And isn't the soul like them? And doesn't the soul go toward the forms? And if you get the soul away from the body enough, you sort of tamp down the needs of the body, doesn't it gravitate towards the forms and grasp them better? Right? So then there's a sort of argument by analogy here. The soul is like the forms in a lot of ways. So isn't it immortal like they're immortal, right? That makes sense as far as it goes. Arguments by analogy are never perfect. They're not deductive. They're imaginative leaps in a way. They're inductive arguments, if we know that phrasing. So there's extrapolation involved, but it sounds right as far as it goes. The soul is akin to the forms, very much like them in a few different ways that we could flesh out. So we could to some extent, it's not 100%, infer that like them, it's immortal, right? And it's unlike the body, which is one particular among others, and the body is definitely mortal. It's unlike the body in a few different ways, so maybe it's unlike the body in being immortal where the body is mortal. But we're not going to complete that line of argument. I'm just suggesting things, and I'm making sure you know that Plato knows that initial argument that involved opposites wasn't completely satisfying, and that's why he's revisiting immortality. And I do think there's a very strong argument there that has to do with the composition of material things versus the apparent unity and simplicity of the soul or the mind. Let's leave it there. I hope we've learned a lot about the forms and about the nature of recollection, and about how a cluster of ideas reinforce each other, right? That's what's happening in the Phaedo. The immortality of the soul, the immortality of the soul, both of those things, the forms themselves, the theory that they exist, and then the theory of recollection, these four things, immateriality, immortality, recollection, the forms, the existence of the forms, these things are a cluster that work together, and arguments in favor of one tend to reinforce our belief in the other things. And so there's a very tight logical package in a way, even though I've pointed out some weaknesses. I hope you found it interesting.